Thank you all for attending. My name is Tim Marshall, the Provost of the New School, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce today Richard Arum to come and speak to us today. And I'm sure that many of you have either read the book or certainly read a lot of the response to the book that's been circulating through all of the mainstream and educational press over the last month or two. Richard's recent co-authored book, which he wrote with Josipa Roksa, Academically Adrift, Limited Learning on College Campuses, has obviously sparked a lot of discussion and debate around the country, and very important debate it is. The book is based on their findings and impressions after following 2,300 students across 24 university campuses over a period of 4 years. So it's a very extensive piece of research. And Richard and Josipa's research indicated that many of the students that they were studying and following were not achieving the key learning goals that the universities and colleges such as our own had established for them, in particular critical thinking and some advanced writing and reasoning skills and so on. So academic adrift has been widely discussed in the press, and the debate that it sparked has caused many of us in positions such as mine across the whole educational sector to really start to consider and debate the meanings and the implications of what it contains. And it adds to a growing number of publications and reporting in tertiary education that is critiquing and reflecting on this educational project of ours in very important ways. But Academically Adrift, I think, is a little different to most others that I know of in the recent past by paying such very close attention to the learning of the students themselves and to really concentrating very specifically on their experience and the outcomes of that in our academies. So the Provost's office thought that it would be a great opportunity to invite Richard here to present this work to us today and to engage us in particular in dialogue, which we'll do afterwards, as a provocation in particular as we're ourselves moving into the Middle States review process. We're in the very beginnings of that, so we're about to go through a very concerted period of reflection and consideration about where we've been, whether we've achieved what we set out to achieve, how we can determine that, and then set the scene for the next phase of the institution going forward and reset our own ambitions in that regard. I also, in that context, want to thank Ron Casimir, who actually has been responsible for setting today's presentation up. So thank you, Ron. Now, there has been a lot of debate about both the research and the findings in Academically Adrift. But I'd say that we should also remain very open to critiques and questioning of our own assumptions about what we do and how we do it and whether we're really doing what we say we do, which is basically, I think, what a lot of this is about. We make statements about critical thinking and other things like that, but how do we know whether we are achieving the goals that we're setting out for ourselves and for our students and our programs without the kind of research that's going on here? So, as I said, we're going to the Middle States period, and we'll be doing our own analysis and evaluation and reflection on how well we are meeting our own core mission as an institution, and particularly in light of the changing needs and expectations of students, of employers, the economy, and the academy. Obviously, things are changing around us. This is not a static enterprise. And here at the New School, we have particularly prided ourselves on our ability to reinvent, to be relevant, and to have the capacity to both embrace and to lead change. And the years ahead, I'm sure, will be no different in that regard. We also pride ourselves on our capacity to foster critical thinking and engagement with communities and various thematic issues of importance of the day. So I think the particular topics that you've addressed, Richard, are very relevant to the New School. So before I welcome Richard to the microphone, I just want to let you know how we're organizing the program. Karen DeMoss, Associate Professor of Education at Eugene Lang College and Director of the Institute of Urban Education, will offer brief remarks in response to today's presentation, and then we'll open up the floor for a Q&A session afterwards and get some debate going. So now I'd like to welcome Richard Arum. He's a faculty member at our colleague institution down the street at New York University. I'm sure you're in big demand right now, so that probably is in our favor. He's a professor in the Department of Sociology with a joint appointment at the Steinhardt School of Education. And he's also the director of the Educational Research Program of the Social Science Research Council, where he oversaw the development of the Research Alliance for New York City Schools, a research consortium designed to conduct ongoing evaluation of the New York City public schools. In addition to Academically Adrift, he is also the author of Judging School Discipline, The Crisis of Moral Authority in American Schools, Harvard University Press, 2003, and a co-editor of a comparative study on expansion, differentiation, and access to higher education in 15 countries, titled Stratification in Higher Education, a Comparative Study at Stanford University Press, 2007. Arum received a Master's of Education in Teaching and Curriculum from Harvard and a PhD in Sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. And we're very pleased to welcome him here today and to get this discussion underway by presenting his work to us. Thank you, Richard.
Tim, thank you very much for that gracious introduction, and as importantly, thank you for your openness in your leadership role to considering these issues at the New School. I'd like to start off by just acknowledging this is a collaborative social science research project, and so it's not possible without the work of many, many people and many institutions, including not just my co-author, Josipa Roksa, but in addition, the foundations that made this work possible, the Council for Aid to Education, which administered the CLA and scored the CLA for us, and probably most important, the 24 collaborating institutions that opened their doors to us and did the actual work of interacting with the students to make sure that the CLA was administered, the surveys were distributed, and transcripts data was provided to us. My presentation today is going to focus in large part on the recently released book, Academically Adrift, but it's going to go beyond that as well. And it's going to go beyond this. This book was only out, it's only been out for 2 months. However, for those in the audience who've published with academic university presses, you probably know that they are notoriously slow. And so from the time they had the manuscript to the time the book came out in January, that was more than 18 months. And so the book is based on the first 2 years of data on students in college and university, but by the time the book came out, we had all 4 years of data, and so we're going to update the findings with that. And not only did we have all 4 years of data, we had surveyed the students 1 year out of college to see how they were doing making transitions into the current very difficult labor market that they're facing. And so I will also update briefly the findings where we care about, the book is important, we believe, because we care about these students. And so I know you'll be very interested in seeing how these students that we care so much about are faring today in, again, these very difficult times. I will be addressing 4 questions in today's presentation. First, the most basic, are students improving their critical thinking, complex reasoning, and writing skills during college? Second, we will ask, we're sociologists, Josipa and myself, and so we're very interested in questions of social inequality. And so we're interested in, to the extent to which learning outcomes in college are associated with inequality and by social background. Descriptive characteristics, characters ascribed to you at birth, such as race, social class, and gender. Third, and probably most important for practitioners in the audience, like the provost here today, is what are the specific experiences, college experiences, that are associated with student learning, as well as the college context that are associated with student learning. These are really the central questions for those that are interested in how do we improve learning on our campus and address the problems identified by the book. And then finally, like I said, we'll be looking at how individuals are faring today. To address these questions, we could not rely on federal data that has existed in K-12 education for decades. Since at least 1980, the federal government has been collecting national probability surveys of students in K-12 education, following them over time with repeated measures of student performance, and to allow one to assess the determinants of learning, how learning outcomes were related to academic experiences, school climates, social background. That type of data has not existed in higher education. And that, we think, is a national shame and a national disgrace. Because of that shortcoming, we were forced on our own to create this data set and to do it, if you will, out of our back pocket, with going cap in hand to foundations and saying, can we have some money to cobble together this resource in order to do this, this research. So we've collected data. First of all, it's got a longitudinal design. We're following the same students as they entered college and university in fall 2005. They're given an assessment, the CLA assessment. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. They're retested again in spring 2007, the end of their sophomore year. They're retested again spring 2009. If they're on track, that's the end of their fourth year. And we are also following them up last spring, and this next month we're going to be surveying them again to see how they're faring after graduation. It is a large-scale data set. It is not a national probability sample, and let's be clear on that. What it is it's based on, the book is based on 24 diverse four-year institutions. By diverse, I would say it includes large flagship public research universities, some elite private residential liberal arts colleges, some historically black colleges, some Hispanic serving institutions. It's very diverse, and in the book we go to great care to show how these colleges and universities are largely representative of higher education in America today. If you went to the dreaded US News rankings, college rankings, their website, they've got the top 100 colleges and the top 100 universities in this country. We have 10 of those 24 schools are on those lists, one of those two top 100 lists. One of them is in the top 10. So we've got ample colleges and universities at the top, but we've got more than that. Some of the prior research in higher education, The Shape of the River, the work by Doug Massey, Bowen and Bach, and so on, has only looked at elite higher education, the top 30 colleges and universities in this country. This is looking at the real higher education system in America today. In 2005-2007, we had slightly over 2,000 college students in our sample. By 2009, you'll see that we have slightly more institutions. How did you do that magic? We did it because we joined the project in 2006 after the Council for Aid to Education was already surveying, giving this assessment to the CLA assessment to students. And we joined the project and said, you're already giving them this assessment. Let's not just have test scores. Let's be able to do basic social science research. Let's survey them and collect their transcripts. We had convinced by 2007 24 schools to join our project. By 2009, we had slightly more than that. We also lost a college in there as well, but that's why there's a change in the dynamic of the number of institutions. There's also, if you note, a change in the number of students, and of course that's because many college students drop out over the four-year period. We had no capacity because we were dependent on the collaborating institutions to follow those kids up like a national probability survey would. And we also did not have a possibility to follow them up if they transferred to another institution. Now, what our data set does have, though, is a breadth of information. It has detailed questions on family background. It has detailed information on the high schools that individuals attended, including we asked for the name of the high school and went to federal government data and matched it with characteristics of those high schools, detailed questions about students' college experiences and college context, and as well as data from college transcripts. It also critically has this assessment, the collegiate learning assessment. And so that's the objective measure of student performance over time. You know, it's likely you'd want to know a little bit more about that. So let me tell you about what the CLA, first of all, the dimensions of assessed are critical thinking, complex reasoning, and written communication. The distinguishing characteristics of the CLA is, first of all, it's a direct measure of student performance. much of the research in higher education before this book has been based on students' self-reports of learning. So students graduate and they're asked, how much did you learn when you were in college? And these kids are American, so what do they say? I learned a lot. It's a great. Of course, students don't know what they don't know, and they have no way to compare their learning to anything other than maybe the student down the hall, and they're probably pretty clear that the student down the hall isn't learning very much, so they think that they're learning pretty more, and they also have the grades. They're getting very good grades, as we'll see shortly. So based on that, they'd also believe that they'd be learning a lot. So it is not that. It is an objective measure of learning. Now, some of the other assessments out there, CAP and MAP, are multiple choice tests of critical thinking and complex reasoning. The CLA is not a multiple choice test. Rather, it's a holistic assessment that's based on open-ended prompts representing real-world scenarios. That is, students are given a task to do that they might be confronted with after they graduated by an employer. And so it's a complex, complicated task that asks them to make sense of a set of documents and to do something with those documents. I'll give you an example in a second. It is used in other contexts. It is one of the measures that's being used by the voluntary system of accountability. 300 colleges and universities in this country have voluntarily assessing students and publicly reporting outcomes. In 2016, it is the basis of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development's HELO project, their measure of generic skills. In 2016, for the first time, there's going to be a cross-national comparison of student performance in higher education, just the way there's been comparisons done in the past of math and science performance in elementary and secondary school. PISA, TIMSS, it's coming to higher education, and starting in 2016, they're going to be using a modified version of the CLA as their generic measure of higher order skills. Now, with that said, let's be perfectly clear. All measures of student performance, all measures of these concepts are by definition imperfect and limited. The CLA is certainly has those drawbacks. It is not a perfect measure of these underlying concepts, and it is limited. It is not a measure of subject-specific skills. So if you wanted to do an assessment of student learning more broadly, you'd want to use multiple measures, ideally, of student performance in many domains, not just something like this CLA, generic measure of higher order skills, but also subject-specific skills and the like. However, the generic higher order skills are the skills that transfer from job to job, occupation to occupation, industry to industry. They are the skills that help people navigate the increasingly unstable economic environment that they're exposed to. There are also, of course, the higher order skills that are the foundations for people's ability to demonstrate democratic citizenship, to make sense of the world and to make decisions based on it. And so they don't measure, it's not a perfect measure of anything, but it is, we believe, a useful tool to help us get a sense of what's happening with students today in higher education. Let me give you a task from the CLA, and then we'll get into the data. So the test is administered online. So you're put up in you're presented you're given a computer, and you're given a task like this. You're asked to imagine that you're an assistant to Pat Williams, the president of Dynatech, a company that makes precision electronic instruments and navigational equipment. There's a recommendation that you are to buy a private plane for your corporation to help with sales. There's an accident of one of these planes, and you're asked to make a recommendation based on, now that there's been an accident, what should we do? Should we go ahead with the purchase or not? You're given a set of documents. You're given newspaper articles. a federal accident report, email exchanges between your boss and the people trying to sell the plane. You're given technical manuals. And you're asked to, based on this information, to write a memo with your recommendation and the basis for your recommendation. Now, that's not a simple task. That's a complicated task. It's one that asks you to first of all, to take the documents that are put in front of you and to think critically about them, to cross-examine them, to interrogate them, right? Some of them are, the validity of them is likely higher than others. You're asked to synthesize across these documents, complex reasoning. And you're asked to write something based on it that requires you to produce a logical argument where the evidence supports your position. Not a simple task by any means, but exactly the kind of task that you would expect college students to be able to do better at as they progress through college. And again, that's what the assessment is. If the website is from the Council for Aid to Education, they have more of these prompts. They have a grading rubric they use for it, and so on, if you want more information on the assessment instrument itself. Okay, so now you've got the setup for what we're doing. The next slide, I think, is arguably kind of the crux of the argument. It's enough anyway for the provost to know exactly what the problems are in higher education today. We asked students, we went in as social scientists, and we asked students, this is in the spring of their sophomore year. In the previous semester, we were naive social scientists, we asked, how many courses did you take last semester? How many where you wrote more than 20 pages over the course of the semester? Not a 20-page paper. Over the course of the semester, more than 20 pages. How many courses? Naive social scientists. The data came back so skewed to zero, it's collapsed here. Did you take any course, a single course, where you wrote more than 20 pages over the course of the semester? And half of the students say no. We did not take a single course where we wrote more than 20 pages over the course of the semester. Next, we asked them, again, the same, how many courses have you taken where you have read more than 40 pages per week on average? More than 40 pages per week on average. 32% came back and said, none. I don't have a single course where I was asked to read more than 32 pages per week on average. One could combine these, have both course requirements and neither course requirements. Same basic story. Large numbers of students are figuring out ways to navigate through college and university with very little asked of them. Next important slide, I think. These two slides, again, if you're pressed for time, you can go home after this. We asked students about their time use. How many hours were they studying and preparing for class? Students report spending 15 hours in class and labs, and they report spending only 12 hours, or at most 13 hours, studying and preparing for class, 12 to 13 hours. A third of that time is what they report studying with friends, studying in groups. So if you're thinking of just studying alone, 8 hours per week studying and preparing for class. And studying and preparing for class today, as anyone who has kids like I do know, studying alone means, they're studying alone and you check your email, your web. So even studying alone isn't arguably what it used to be. But only 8 hours per week. Now you combine those study in class and studying, that's not all that much time. First of all, it's less time than one engages in high school simply being in the building in an elementary school or secondary school. And when you go and interview freshmen on colleges and universities today, they'll tell you something a little surprising. They say, I thought college and university was going to be harder than high school. And I'm surprised it's not. It's easier. That's what the qualitative research suggests. And it is in terms of their hours devoted to the task. Another way to look at it, of course, is over time. Maybe it was never any different. Maybe college and university was always primarily a social activity. Well, it's always been a social activity in part, but it's changed. It's changed dramatically over time. I'm going to show you one slide now, the only slide that we're presenting that's not based on our own empirical research, but the research of others, because I think it's so important. Philip Babcock and Mindy Marx's work. Philip Babcock is a labor economist at University of California, Santa Barbara. He has his own website up. You can download this paper. He also has a great paper on grade inflation, the effects of grade inflation, that I'd also recommend. He went back and looked at every time use survey going all the way back to the 1920s of full-time college students to see how many hours they reported studying. From the 1920s to the 1960s, it was relatively constant. A full-time college student spent about 35 to 40 hours per week in class and studying. That's what full-time meant. Beginning in 1960, things start to change. If you're just looking at studying and preparing for class, you go from 25 hours per week studying and preparing for class to today, again, 12 or 13 hours studying per week. It's dropped in half. It's dropped in half. Now, it's dropped in half at the same time. If we were going to put students' grades on there, the grades have gone in the other direction. So college freshmen were asked in the UCLA HERE study, incoming college freshmen are asked, do you think you're going to get a B average or better in college and university? And in 1971, the first time they asked this, B average or better, 27% of the brave students said, yes, I'm going to get a B average or better in college and university. Today, it's close to 70%. Again, in just a number of decades. And you know what? We don't disappoint them. We don't disappoint them. In our study, we had 36% of our students saying they studied alone 5 or fewer hours per week. Studied alone, studied and prepared for class alone, 5 or fewer hours per week. 36% of our sample. We have their transcripts. Their grade point averages were 3.2. So again, college and university students have figured out ways to navigate through the system with little asked of them, little applied, but with the grades, the positive grades that are able to give them a credential that they believe is what college and university is all about, a credential that can be traded for labor market success. That's what many students believe, and we've told them as consumers and clients that that's what's important. We have not provided a counter-narrative to that account, and again, this is the way they've interpreted those behaviors. They find courses, they find programs that are easy, courses that are easy, and they're able to navigate through, again, with low demands. Well, given these low demands, we can go to the CLA test, but is there any surprise what the results are going to be here? The results are very low. You would, with a treatment this week, one would not expect great gains on any measure, and the CLA does this multiple choice measure CAP is being used by the Wabash study. They have results online, Wabash. They have large numbers of colleges and universities. They're following students over time, giving them not the CLA, but this multiple choice test of critical thinking, complex reasoning. They are finding the same thing as we are, identical, a different instrument, different colleges and universities, the same finding. And of course it's the same findings because, again, if students are being asked to do so little, you're not going to see them moving on any indicator, including an indicator like the CLA. Now, we get a 0.18 standard deviation change from 2005 to 2007. It goes up to 0.47 standard deviation by 2009. A way to think about that would be if someone, if you started at the 50th percentile of your entering freshman class, 2 years later, if you took the same test with a new batch of high school graduates coming in, you would have moved up slightly to the 57th percentile. We don't think that's great gains, and we translate those findings into another way of talking about it, that for 45% of the sample over the first 2 years, there are no statistically significant gains on this measure. We measure statistically significant gains here by that we're looking for improvements of 8.5 points on the CLA measure. The CLA measure ranges by over 1,000 points. We only want 9 points is significant. It's not significant. They're not in our measure. We're not counting for them. So if you add a test that went from 0 to 100, if they moved up 1 point on a 0 to 100 test, they're not in that 45%. The 45%, they're showing little to no gains on the first 2 years, and by 2009, it's only 36%. But again, why would one expect anything different given the reports of what they're experiencing in college? Okay, enough of the bad news. Let's move to kind of the determinants of learning. What can one do if one wants to address and improve these outcomes in college? First of all, again, in kind of complex statistical models, we try to identify associations that have a wide range of backgrounds. We control for prior 2005 scores. We control for prior SAT scores. We control for student family background and so on. And we see that something we've known in K-12 education for decades and is taught to teachers being prepared to go into our public schools, high expectations matter. Students that report that their faculty have high expectations for them learn more on this objective measure than students that don't report for it. High expectations of faculty students respond to. Second, reading and writing requirements. When students are in at least one course with the reading requirement, more than 40 pages per week on average, and at least one course with 20 pages of writing over the course of the semester, they demonstrate more gain than if not. So they are responsive. The CLA, as a measure, it's an imperfect measure, but it's sensitive to instruction, and that sort of curricular exposure yields changes in greater improvement than otherwise. What about time on task, hours studying? Well, again, the more time on task, the more hours studying alone, the higher your CLA performance is going to be than otherwise. The more time you put into studying, the greater your gains are going to be on this test. However, a very interesting finding, when we pulled out studying alone versus studying with peers, studying with friends, the more hours students reported studying with peers, studying with friends, the lower their CLA score was over time. It's not just neutral, it's negative, and it's associated with learning outcomes in the same negative direction as the amount of hours spent in fraternities and sororities. Okay? That's what studying in groups, studying with friends means today. Doesn't mean that you can't design innovative curriculum models where it's highly structured and collaborative and students are learning a lot. That is certainly pedagogically possible, I believe, as a progressive educator. However, let us see this as a caution that as students today report studying alone, on average, it is not yielding the outcomes one would expect. College majors. Again, we have variation. These are complicated to interpret because a lot of it's driven by selection of students into majors and the like and so on. But nevertheless, if we control for the 2005 scores and predict the 2007 scores, we see a pattern that's at least of interest. We see a pattern that suggests that the traditional arts and science core of colleges and universities is the place where the greatest gains occur. They occur in humanities and social science programs. They occur in science and math. The humanity and science programs, of course, they are teaching tasks very closely related to the ones being asked of for the CLAs. So one might say there's a little bias in the measure to yield this outcome. However, in science math, that's not the case. What this traditional core of the college and university has in common is that that is the place where academic rigor still exists to the extent it exists on colleges and universities today. So in our book, we break up majors and look at things like reading demands, writing demand, hour studying, and you'll see that in those departments are places where there is greater academic rigor than elsewhere. So again, to highlight, faculty expectations matter, course requirements matter, hour studying alone positively tracks with outcomes, and again, the traditional arts and science majors. Now, I want to get to our third question, the variation in outcomes with respect to inequality. We looked, first of all, at inequality in outcomes based on parents' education. Here we have data for their performance in 2005, their performance in 2007, their performance in 2009. What one sees here is students, not surprisingly, if their parents were high school educated or less compared to graduate and professional degrees, they are starting out behind, a little bit behind children from graduate and professional degrees. That's no surprise. And as they progress through college and universities, both these groups are gaining at roughly equal rates. So students without regard to their parental education are receiving relatively similar gains from the colleges and universities they attend. When we move from parents' education to race, we find a different pattern that's much more disturbing. Like in K-12 education, we see a pattern where black-white differences are increased the longer college students spend in colleges and universities today. In the book, we also look at Hispanic and Asian student outcomes. The differences there are not pronounced with respect to white students. They are pronounced here with the black-white gaps, where in the first 2 years of college, African-American students are gaining very little. Their gains are much more comparable to whites in the last 2 years of college. But again, these are partially affected by different rates of attrition of students as they move through as well. However, again, black-white gaps are increasing for students the longer they spend in college. In K-12 education, much of the discourse and policy around it has focused on closing those gaps in learning. In higher education, I would argue, we have not had a similar dialogue where the academic community has been asked to address these gaps. Institutional variation. So this picture is very similar to K-12 education. If you wanted to partition the variance, how much of the difference in growth occurs within a university versus across a university, one would find that 23% of the variation in learning occurs across colleges and universities. 23% is significant. Colleges and universities can make a difference, right? It matters where you go to school. Some schools do this better than others. However, equally important, 77% of the variation is within a college and a university. The majority of variation is within a college and university. So if you're just looking down the street for an exemplary institution, and I'll point north, so there's no conflict of interest, you'd be making a mistake, because all you would have to do if you really were serious about improving learning outcomes, you'd want to look within for the exemplary units within your institution where students are being exposed to rigorous academic experiences, applying themselves and learning at high rates. At every college and university we looked at, we found pockets like that. We found pockets where students were exposing themselves to academic rigor, applying themselves and learning at much higher rates than average. In every college and university, including the best in our sample, we found pockets where they weren't being asked to apply themselves. Little was asked of them, and little was accomplished. So again, we see this as an important finding to think about when we'll talk about policy recommendations in a few slides. Now, we only have a couple of dozen colleges and universities in our study. We're not able to say much about where this institutional variation comes from. If you had a national probability survey like K-12 education, you could say public versus private. You could look at the differences between Catholic institutions, historically black colleges, and so on. We don't have that kind of power to make those sorts of claims based on the statistical inference from our sample. We do, however, look at one institutional variable that's of concern to sociologists, and that's peer climates. And we look at peer climates in terms of college selectivity, entering SAT scores of students. We believe the entering SAT scores of the average class capture something about peer climate, the likelihood that you're going to be embedded in academic environments where students might be oriented a little bit more towards their studies, where also we believe this is probably going to track something with kind of curriculum expectations as well. And we find indeed a significant finding, not in the book, but once we had the 2009 data in hand, the full 4 years of data, the more selectivity of the institution, the higher SAT scores of the entering class, one learns more, slightly more than other colleges and universities. Again, that's not where all the institutional variation is coming from, but we do notice significant differences there. Okay, let's move from them students learning in college to how they're faring today. And again, I think we said we started with some bad news, and we had the news of how to improve this, and now we're going to be back to a little bit, I think, of bad news again. Because as we know, they're very difficult economic circumstances students are facing today. These students are highly indebted. 60% of them report having loans, and if they did report having loans, they reported having, on average, $27,000 in debt on their student loans. Other research suggests that they probably also have something like $4,000 on their credit cards, where they've often used the credit card for academic expenses. Highly indebted, many of these students. Although they're indebted, they are struggling in the labor market. If you apply a very stringent, formal Bureau of Labor Statistic definition of unemployment, you find that 9% are unemployed. By unemployed, we mean they're not taking any classes. They're not even a single class on the side. If they're part-time working, even if part-time in Starbucks, they're employed. These are and if they're saying they're not looking for work, these are people that are saying, I'm looking for work and I can't find any work. Okay, 9%, similar to the national average, but again, these are very young, well-educated students that one would expect would be doing significantly better. If they found jobs, they were not of particularly high incomes, but rather get into the minutia of the income data. I think the next statistic is even more compelling. 31% of the students reported that they were back living at home. They were living with parents and family members. And they were living with parents and family members because they have high debts and they can't find jobs to support themselves and pay off the debts, large numbers of these students. So they are struggling. I do not think that they went in, nor did their parents expect that 31% of them were going to be back at home. More troubling to us than the labor market outcomes are the outcomes around democratic citizenship. Because we, again, believe that college and university is not just about preparing students for labor market success, but also for preparing them to function as democratic citizens in a society. And so we asked them some questions about this. First of all, we asked them about their news. How often do you read the newspaper in print or online? In print or online? And 30% of them came back and said, monthly or never. These are college graduates a year out facing these very, very difficult situations. And 30% report, I read the news in print or online, monthly or never. This tracks, by the way, with what we've asked them. If you ask them about kind of hours studying, right? Colleges and universities are about not just promoting higher order skills, critical thinking, complex reasoning, and the like. They are about training students in attitudes and dispositions about being productive, successful adults that are engaged in society in constructive ways. If they're not being taught and trained in those attitudes and dispositions, you get this outcome. So if you ask students reporting 5 or fewer hours studying, and this is studying with friends or any studying, 52% say, I read the paper monthly or never. And if they've been asked to apply themselves a little bit more and are worked harder, more than 15 hours a week, which, by the way, was still less than the average 3 or 4 decades ago, they're much more likely to be keeping up with the news today. Another way to look at this question would be civic engagement. Another way to look at civic engagement, we asked a very broad question. How often do you discuss politics or public affairs with friends, family members, or colleagues, in person, on the telephone, or online? As broad a definition as we could get, right? We were just, please tell us you're going to do this. Please, we could not construct a survey item that was, if you will, fishing for positive responses more than this. 39% say monthly or never. 39% monthly or never. And again, this tracks also with the effort that's being applied and asked of students in colleges and universities today, where 47% of those spending less than 5 hours studying say they don't discuss politics or public affairs. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide for time. Sorry. And just do a couple more policy recommendations and what can be learned for institutions like the New School, like NYU, like every college and university to address these troubling findings. Policy recommendations. First of all, we are very strong and adamant that federally imposed accountability systems would be a mistake. They would be counterproductive. One, we do not believe that the measurement is at a stage where one could even conduct these assessments in a responsible way. But second, we also have great reservations that federally imposed mandates and regulations are likely to lead to positive outcomes rather than being counterproductive and leading to a host of unintended negative outcomes that would do more harm than good. However, we do believe that accountability should be built in at lower levels in the system, right? So being against federally imposed accountability doesn't mean that we don't think students, faculty, and institutions, administrators and institutions should be held accountable. We do, but we think that there's mechanisms within the system already that can accomplish that effectively if they fulfilled the functions they were set out to do. So private institutions, of course, have boards of trustees. Public institutions have state regents and overseers. They should be asking their administrators, what are you doing to improve learning? How are you measuring it? How are you focusing on accomplishing these goals? Administrators should be asking those questions of faculty. Faculty should be asking students to be holding students a little bit more accountable as well. We do believe the federal government, however, has a role to play. First of all, the federal government today spends billions and billions of dollars promoting research and encouraging colleges and universities to focus on research. We, of course, think that's a worthy end. We believe in research, and colleges and universities can play a large role in improving society through generating knowledge and through knowledge-generating functions. However, the incentives are so much in that direction that we believe it is likely that they've distracted colleges and universities from focusing on their core missions of undergraduate education. And again, we believe that the federal government could provide incentives for institutional improvement, innovation, and assessment, just the way programs like that have existed in K-12 education. We also think that the federal government could play a critical role by improving research infrastructure. And the most easy way to do that would be creating a national probability survey to be available to social science researchers of longitudinal data set where students move through higher education and were given an objective measure of learning. There's a current study going on where students are in 11th grade today. There is funding already in place to follow those kids into college, to survey them next year as 12th grade, follow them into college. We are urging the federal government, and please join us if you believe in this, urging the federal government to, next year when they're seniors, give them an objective measure, like the CLA or CAP or MAP or something, and then follow them over time with an objective measure and make that data available to the larger social science research community, right? It's a national shame, it's a national disgrace that we don't have that kind of resource here in America. Now, accountability, there's good reasons to be against that, but there's no reason to be against basic research to understand these processes better so that we can improve learning in this outcome. And again, that wouldn't cost incredible amounts of sum. That would be something on the order of 8, 10 million, something like that. You could create this research infrastructure so to basically put people like Arum and Roksa out of business, and we would welcome that. We don't think this is the way it should be done privately. It should be done more systematically. For institutional improvement, we believe that it's important. Institutional leadership, just in K-12 education, institutional leadership, whether it's a principal or a president or a provost, is key. And again, I would applaud and commend Tim Marshall for demonstrating with his physical presence that he is concerned about these issues, and he's demonstrating leadership on it. Institutional leadership can ensure that emphasize learning, both symbolically and substantively, with plans developed for institutional improvement that include support for ongoing assessments of program quality and student learning outcomes. I'd be happy to talk more about that in the questions and answers. Second, just the way we believe administrative leadership is important, faculty leadership is also important. Student learning is a faculty issue. We believe that just the way faculty have been pushed to the periphery of colleges and universities today, undergraduate learning has been pushed to the periphery. They go together. They go together. Putting them back at the center of colleges and universities, saying that we should be thinking about when we make investments in colleges and universities today, the investments should be aligned with this outcome. The investment should be about academic outcomes. And today, in colleges and universities, full-time faculty are in decline. And what has been increasing in colleges and universities is staff that are not associated with academic functions, but with all the other functions that go with students being viewed as consumers and clients. We think faculty have a role to work together individually and collectively, defining academic rigor and ensuring it happens across programs and classes. If the provost dictates it, it's not going to work. Faculty as a group collaboratively have to do this. And that includes thinking about grading standards as well. Finally, we believe in promoting organizational cultures that emphasize student academic engagement, not just social engagement and student retention. The prior research that's been based on self-reported learning has argued that the best thing to do to get learning outcomes in college and university is to get the students socially engaged. Because the more students are socially engaged and active, they are the same students, that correlates with the same students that think they learned a lot. Active students have a high opinion of their learning. However, the kids that are shy and are not engaged, they aren't so confident that they've been learning a lot. So based on that policy, we have designed programs that are not aligned with objective gains in learning outcomes. It's not just that they are, they've been wrong. They've led us down the wrong path. Last slide on future research, and then I think there's going to be some comments from one of my colleagues, and then we will open it up for questions and answers. So just what's coming next, we are tracking these students over time. One of the things we're interested in is whether or not their labor market outcomes are aligned with their learning outcomes. We think that's an open question, whether or not employers really do care about higher order skills that are measured in the CLA. We think it could be just the institutional selectivity, the credentialing effects might be driving, and maybe the students are right. And the students also think that the most important thing in college and university today, or as important as learning, is the social networks you build. Maybe they're right about that too. So we're asking questions that are going to be able to assess that and try and address that question. And then finally, we also believe that labor market outcomes are only one outcomes of colleges and universities. We think as important are marriage market outcomes. That many individuals find their spouse or partner in colleges and universities. They are the ones that they attend the same colleges and universities. And we're very attentive to that as well as we track the students over time. Are they in relationships? Are they cohabitating? Are they married? Where did they meet their partners? And so on. So with that said, we have a website, a project website, highered.ssrc.org. The project was housed at the Social Science Research Council. If you go to that website, you'll find lots of free resources, including a report on the 4 years of finding with the policy recommendations and so on, available for free download. You'll also find we've tried to collect the major media reporting on the subject, more descriptions on the project, frequently asked questions, and the like. Thanks very much, Karen.
Thank you, Richard. The presentation was rich, and the book is even richer. I would really suggest that you take a read. It's worthy of close study. It's deceptively simple. Nice, clear paragraphs, and you read along, and you think, okay, I get that point. 2 or 3 pages later, you think, oh, wait a minute. This piece that they've just brought in here makes me question what I think I understood about the prior questions. So there's no oversimplification inside the book about the complexities involved in the work, but it is also a pretty nice and easy read, so I highly recommend it. I think it's in the context of the new school right now, the kinds of things that you're recommending that institutions do, we're doing. We have task forces looking at assessment, and they are designed for our middle states work to come from the faculty. Each program is designing its own work, so kudos to the new school for those design pieces. Interestingly, our retention group hasn't looked so much at academic rigor, and so we may be taking up this book as a study piece, so thank you for that. I wanted to bring in 3 areas that might be of interest to talk about. Richard talked a lot about one of them. My area of expertise is in K-12 policy, and we've certainly lived through the accountability movement. I'm not going to bore you with all of the stories. You read enough of them in the paper, but there are a few. There's some pieces that were explored here and also in the book about relevant K-12 policy pieces. But I'm not sure we're making as much of the parallels with K-12 as maybe we ought to. For example, the OECD lessons for K-12, we surprisingly found that on the higher order thinking tests, we actually were going down, much lower than we thought we were going to be. Germany did the same. Germany has recovered. The United States has not. So there's some interesting pieces, and if we're going to have a 2016 CLA test internationally, we should be braced as a higher ed community for what those findings may show. We do get a lot of public funding, maybe not you and I personally for our salaries here, but through the students that are at our schools, and the same policymakers who are looking at public education funding in K-12 are the ones who are making policy for higher education. Public perceptions around school teachers, they got the summers off, right? It's an easy job. Faculty members, they have the same perceptions. So those are some other kinds of pieces to think about. Another piece that I wondered about, Richard, and would be curious about your thinking on this, you don't think that there's as much a danger of some of these things happening in higher ed as in K-12. I hope you're right. But higher education as a sector is sort of less organized. It's been easier to establish for-profit universities. It's been easier to establish other alternatives like online. And I'm a little bit curious about whether or not as a sector we are going to sort of be able to look like we might hope we look in the future. There's some cautions that come from the K-12 world that we should, I hope, be aware of. Educators in K-12 are now on the defensive. They did not, as you say, construct an alternative counter-narrative. One of the things this book allows us to do as academia is sort of control the discussion instead of having the government report come down on us, so you've given us a great opportunity there. It has delimited the curriculum. The findings about the different majors suggest that we won't be subject to a delimited curriculum if we can use your work as a basis, and that's good. But data have become both the goal and the reason for being for K-12, and that would be something we would want not to happen in higher education. Credentialing has increased. There's a lot of discussion about credentialing in the book that's quite rich. Some good lessons, or lessons for possibility from K-12, as is noted in the book, students do respond to meaningful change. They respond to being asked to do meaningful work. So we can do that, and we can get higher learning from them. Incremental change won't be enough. There's a lot of openness inside the book for faculty sort of taking the lead. It's not quite as vocal as we might like as faculty, but there's a lot of openness inside and implication inside all of these data that a lot of the solution can come from faculty. So I think that that's a really rich place for conversation. One of my favorite things to read was the section where you framed it not as a crisis, not like the nation at risk crisis. Happily, you're framing it for us as a professional issue. And so that actually is a very productive place to start so we avoid the defensiveness that K-12 educators have gone to. And all of your policy implications about faculty coming together, I agree with. One of the things that you have in the opening of the book that you didn't have up here, and I strongly suggest you add to this last two slides, is for those policy recommendations to work, for faculty to be engaged in that kind of work. As you note in the beginning of the book, we really do have to have systems that validate teaching as part of the work and improving the teaching as part of the work. It's not part of our performance assessment systems in higher education, increasingly less so. But my biggest qualm with the book, which you talk a little bit about here, is a little bit less about the book, because clearly what you have done in terms of this research is a really important set of research. But it is premised on a certain kind of analytic and a certain capacity to look at a certain kind of data. And in that, there are two assumptions. The first is that education is instrumental for the individual student, so it's an individual good. Certainly a lot of students across the country think that, but that's one angle. The second angle is that the work of the university is to help be sure we have this competitive society. Both of those have very strong economic underpinnings to them, and you talk a little bit about, in the end, being aware of the democratic pieces, like what's going on in the world, et cetera, discussing politics. But one of the things that we value really strongly here at the New School, and we have another kind of working group working on, is what does it actually look like to participate civically, not in a delivery way, but in a two-way transformative street. And that, in a really in a collaborative way with our communities, not sort of only giving back, but actually also letting those communities inform us. The whole piece of what it might look like to have strong civic engagement learning opportunities, there's questions about how we're doing it now, but A, how we do that, and B, how we put that into this broader narrative that we need to construct as the counter-narrative. That becomes, I hope, part of your next work. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen, for getting us going. We're now in the Q&A session, so are there any cues, any questions?
Thank you, Karen. Very good comments.
First of all, do you want to respond to anything about
No,
Karen has raised?
I agreed with them. I think both the importance of expanding the conversation and the assessment indicators to include things like civic engagement is critical and important. Not just the subject-specific skills and the higher order skills, but also try to tap into that. How we do that is challenging, but again, we can figure it out if we want to. I think Karen's also right in talking about not just the concerns of policymakers and that are coming to higher education, whether you like it or not, but also one of the things that's really struck me about the reception to the book, which was way beyond what we had imagined it to be, is the widespread public concerns about the state of higher education. Let me give you an example. So we got a little coverage when the book was released in mid-January. That day, an AP story was written and put on Huffington Post, which maybe you folks know I had not much familiarity with Huffington Post before, being much more of a New York Times reader. Before the end of the day, there were 5,400 comments. 5,400 comments. They didn't have the book, right? So this wasn't about the book. This was about people's deep concerns with higher education, because I read a few. I confess that after 30 or 40, I stopped reading, and you have to wonder if you're commenter 5,246, you're commenting because you feel a need, an emotional, have this emotional outlet. You're not commenting to join a discussion, because after 5, you know that there's not so the fact that there were so many people that felt the need to express themselves, and I tell you how they tracked, 95 to 99% of them were, this is exactly right. There's a critical problem. Something is fundamentally wrong in higher education that needs to be fixed. And those comments were from the public and also from the academic community themselves. The faculty overwhelmingly have said, when we've gone out and talked about this resonates with what we are feeling and our concerns with the quality of higher education today.
Thanks.
With respect to the recommendations, there's a lot on responsibility here, but there's nothing here about investment from the outside. And since you alluded to things like full-time faculty, the student indebtedness, I'm concerned that this is very kind of about things that the institution has to do, but not what society has to do. As far as, I don't know if part of your data shows the relationship between student performance and percent of full-time faculty, for instance, or class size, or student guidance and support systems, things that are really, really important. And then I wonder, when you talk about indebtedness when they graduate, what about the pressures to earn money while they're in school and how that might impact their performance because they might need to be working more? I don't know if any of these are things you've looked at or will look at in the future, but I just get concerned here that it's going to be, well, it's all the responsibility of the university here, and,
Right. So I think those are really good questions. We do address some of them in the book. Students are working today 5 more hours per week on average than they did in 1960. Again, we saw a 13-hour drop in studying and preparing for class. 5 hours is part of it, but not something else is going on as well. We do in the book talk about a variation. We're not able to measure it with the data in hand. Again, you need a national probability data set that was structured differently than ours to empirically identify the associations between resources and outcomes. In some of my other work on K-12 education, I've demonstrated that those associations exist. Resources do matter. We do mention a little bit in the book how colleges and universities differ today, and some are indeed resource poor. I think if I wrote the book again today, I would have highlighted that more than we did in the book. I think it's a critique, it's a fair critique of the book that we do not emphasize enough the resource inequalities across institutions that exist in the book or in the field today. However, we don't think it's simply a matter of resources either. And we don't think that for a number of reasons. First of all, colleges and universities, the cost of colleges and universities have gone up at twice the rate of inflation since around 1980. And so lots of colleges and universities are not resource poor. They have plenty of resources. It's a question of where they are spending their resources. And they're not spending their resources on academic programs and on full-time faculty devoted to academic activities. And even the full-time faculty they have are often encouraged to spend their time on research and scholarship to attract federal grants. So we think it's a question as much about resource allocation decisions within institutions as it is overall resource levels. Again, though, that's not to say that there aren't some institutions that indeed are so resource poor that the basic quality of instruction is threatened. Let me say one more thing about the resources piece, because when we've been out on the road talking about this, often I've heard from faculty, yeah, we agree with this, but I teach a course with several hundred students, a big lecture. We can't assign writing because I have this big, the class sizes are too big. And I say back to that, the following. I used to teach in Oakland, California in the public schools, a high school English teacher for about a half dozen years. And I had 32 students in a class, 5 students a day. It was the hardest job I had, 160 students. No one would ever have said it is fine not to ask these English, in your English class, to ask and demand that the students write, simply because you don't have the time to grade carefully. Instead, you're trained as a K-12 educator to develop strategies to keep them doing what the students are supposed to be doing. And it doesn't mean you have to read carefully every page they write. You can have them working, doing peer feedback on drafts. You can grade holistically papers. You can take pieces and give more concerted feedback. And so there are strategies that can be used even in large class sizes for students to get the outcomes that they need. We have not done a very good job of teaching and preparing faculty in such strategies. Faculty, as you know, are prepared in doctoral programs where they are typically receive no training at all, or if not no, very limited training on how to do the instruction. And so what happens later on, if you will, is you have teaching and learning centers in some colleges and universities that try and assist faculty in figuring these things out, but very limited, inadequate, and again, some of those strategies can be used to get better outcomes from, with the existing resources we have. I'm not sure that's perfectly satisfied. You're leaning forward.
The issue of student support and guidance, which you don't put in here. I mean, there's an article recently about students' mental health needs increasing dramatically. Students are in higher ed with tremendous numbers of emotional mental health needs.
Okay, well, that was. I know that study in particular. That got a front page story, front page in the New York Times. It was based on the UCLA HERE work, which they survey students on orientation weekend as they come into college, and they're asked, please, please rank whether you're above average, average, or below average on these things. And about 10 in the list is your mental, what did they say in the survey? Something like, rate your mental health. Is it above average, average, or below average? And the report that the Times based that the increased stress of students was based on the declining numbers of students saying that their mental health is above average. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not a measure of stress. It's not a, and the fact that the New York Times elevated that to the front page, and the, this book on Academically Adrift, it was not covered in the regular news until Bob Herbert wrote one of his final columns on it. What gets elevated and picked up? It is not the fact that, yes, students today are struggling. That is part of what people at that age do. Colleges and universities, of course, have a role in helping support those students. However, if you look at funding allocation decisions over the last 3 decades, it has been going overwhelmingly to increased student support services on campus and not academic and programs. And I would love to do all of it, but if you don't do all of it, you got to have some hard conversations about what is the primary goal and function of a college and university. And it's not just the support services, it's also the athletic gyms, the fancy dormitories. Again, all those things are great, but again, given the resource constraints, where is the money going in terms of accomplishing the primary goal and function of what students are coming in here and asking us to really provide for them? And that is a quality education that's going to help them be successful as adults, not just in the labor market, but as citizens.
We don't have the fancy gym problem here, but
no, I understand there's more constraints here than I'm fortunate to have.
Thank you very much. You spoke about the increase. 2 questions. You spoke about the increase of the cost of education in terms of inflation, and then you talked about the changing of the allocation of resources. In your book, or do you know where you can find how those percentages of allocation of resources have changed over time?
Yeah.
Then also adjusting those for inflation based upon what you were saying is that they were going for teaching. Basically the core teaching and faculty support versus student services support, things of that nature.
Yeah, well, there is research out there. It's not great because the quality of the data reporting in terms of expenditures, instructional expenditures and other expenditures is not of the highest quality. However, there is work that's been done like that in the economics of education, and it has shown, again, overwhelmingly that the places that the universities have grown are on these other functions. The staff, the number of staff to students, I think, is something today like 4 to 1, whereas the faculty, it's 14 to 1. So again, there's been an investment in all sorts of other things. You can see how that's changed over time. If you give me your email after, I'll direct you to a specific report that will document that.
Thank you. The other suggestion I have is you talked about measuring CLA scores as far as depending upon the university and seeing how those outcomes translated to jobs later on, and then talking about marriage being one of the things. One of the looks at I would ask is that you also look at in the future is possibly those who are cohabitating or living together, that translates generationally, and how that might look as far as long-term generationally, those who have higher CLA scores, what the outcome is for their offspring.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting angle. As we know, in modern societies, including the U.S., we've moved from a system of class-based homogamy, that is, where people married each other based on their social background of their parents, to a system of educational homogamy where people marry on the basis of similarity with their educational attainment level. And of course, that leads to greater inequality in society because you have two college-educated parents or partners, each working and making income, accelerating the gap with the families behind. So there are these intergenerational effects that are pronounced and quite interesting. Again, though, what we find is there's not just educational homogamy out there in our society. The educational homogamy is structured by the institution attended. That is, there's a very high percentage of individuals that marry their spouse, find their spouse and partner at the same college and university they attended. And that's not a trivial outcome. We think, if you're interested in social inequality, a trivial outcome of the way colleges and universities are associated with stratification and social inequality in our society.
Ron, and then I'll ask maybe a closing question.
Thanks, Richard, for doing this. It was really a wonderful talk and a great provocation to all of us here. Two questions, loosely related. One is just going back to the next, going to what you said was one of the next pieces of research you want to do. Just to ask you if you've got any hunches about when you do the work on labor market outcomes, what you think you're going to find in terms of learning vis-a-vis credentialing or social network effects. The second question goes, both in the presentation and the parts of the book I've read, I think that you and your colleague do an amazingly good job at walking a very difficult line and talking about students. And that line, I would say, is somewhere between blaming the victim, but also not remove it on the assumption that students in some ways are the victim of this process. I don't know if that's the right word to use. But blaming the victim and, but also not completely removing students' agency as part of the process that generates this outcome. So that it's neither something that's being only done to them, but there's a lot of sort of institutional and incentive aspects to the whole higher ed system that are also moving in this direction. So I just wondered if you wanted to comment a bit on that. And I'm partly thinking about, if they're not spending time studying, there's a big difference between whether they're socializing or working. Yeah. And so to what degree the constraints are, and I don't know how much of your data shows this, are being pulled into working while studying, and how much of it is a kind of doing the minimum you need to do to get credentialed so you get a job in the labor market, and being kind of strategic, but not really all that interested in learning. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, so first of all, the students, we do believe that ultimately one's education is an individual's responsibility, a student's responsibility. And again, we find in every college and university we looked at, students that were able to find pockets of rigor, to apply themselves and to learn. Again, we think it's harder for them to do it given the way the system is set up today, but they still can. Your question about what are they doing there? There's a sociologist at UC Irvine, Stephen Brint, who again has a good website with all his papers up, who's done a lot of looking about kind of their time use, more detailed time use information, as well as some great qualitative interviews where he asks people what they're doing with their money. And what he finds, and again, there's got to be a lot of variation across U.S. institutions on this, but he's at UC Riverside. But what he finds is that, first of all, it's overwhelmingly the time is being used to socialize. That's the big driver of this. And students are working a little bit more, but they're interestingly, when they're asked what they're doing with their money, and not just from earning, but from college loans, they talk about seeing it not as an investment in their education, but they see it as an ability to kind of engage in this, their understanding of what a college life is all about. That is, they see it as a consumption good. They see it as they want, they're taking out money in part not to simply pay for their education, but to be able to experience how they understand today what it means to be a college student, which is to live in dorms, to socialize a lot, to go out with your friends, to go travel, international travel. This is the kind of things that students are talking about. So it turns out, I think it's a little bit more complicated than, yes, and certainly you could find students that are working 40 hours a day to pay the tuition, at CUNY or at many institutions. Absolutely, that's occurring. But there's something more complicated going on, which is that the identity, what it means to be, how people understand the college student identity, the definition of the role itself has changed over time, and in ways that have really removed it from kind of this core academic understanding of it, that it's about academic learning, knowledge, paths to purpose, and so on. Your other comment was about your first question.
Just your hunch about.
Oh, the hunch about where the findings is. Well, we did ask the students how many of you. It's only 1 year out, so we think that after 2 years you'll get a little bit more stability in these findings. We did look a little bit. We asked them, did your employer ask you to see your transcript? Right? If employers really care about this stuff, you'd think they'd look at the transcript. Not too many. It was like a low 20s said their employers looked at it. We also asked them, did the person hiring you for the job go to the same college, university you went to? And we asked them the question, and we got a little bit more on that, a little bit more than, it's about 25%. And we asked them, is there someone, are there people at the place you're working that went to the same college and university you went to? And again, we found that was much higher, in the mid-40s. So again, these networks matter, the credentials matter. It's unclear to me whether the learning stuff is really going to track with the labor market outcomes, and it's really unclear to me because there's a lot of hand-wringing from corporate America about this problem. But they've solved this problem. They've taken their jobs that require these skills to Ireland and to India. They import engineers for these jobs. So there's a lot of hand-wringing about this problem, but corporate America today is multinational. It's not like the 1950s where corporate America was organized and would have been concerned and motivated and would have fixed this problem. They're not going to come. They're not. The structure of corporate America today does not have that character that they're going to come in and fix this problem for us. They've solved this problem elsewhere, and their orientation's outward. It's our problem to fix, and so I'll end with that.
Thank you. One quick question to close, or one observation, one question. I mean, if it's true that students are navigating their way through education to try and find the path that that enables them to kind of have the lifestyle you're describing, then it seems to imply that there needs to be an institution-wide endeavour to make all of the courses across all the fields and disciplines comparably rigorous and demanding, so that there's not that pathway. I'm not saying that's the right thing, but that could be drawn from that. But the question would be, a lot of the anxiety within higher education right now is really around a generational issue. In other words, the faculty not really understanding new learning modes that have come up from students who are engaged in social media and online practices and what have you, and technologies, and Gen Y is completely different and we don't understand them, et cetera, et cetera. I haven't heard any of that. It's actually what you've been talking about has been much more about application and time in class and time at book and writing, and really stuff that hasn't changed for a long time. And I just want to get your reflections on that in closing. Yeah, well, good comments. I do think the reform has to be institution-wide, or the students will figure out ways to navigate around any reform efforts that occurred. In terms of technology, I think it's absolutely true that we have not been all that effective in using that technology and innovating in terms of kind of how we reach students and how we use technology effectively.
That's true of K-12 education and would be true of higher education as well. However, I do not think it's as simple as, I think it's a more complicated problem than just the technology piece. We definitely have a problem today where the students are not engaged in their academic instruction. But I think why they're not engaged in their academic instruction is much more complicated than simply that we're not. Our pedagogy is not technologically sophisticated to meet them halfway. They use, for example, the technology is used by students in part to navigate the system, right? So how do they use the technology to find out where the easy programs are, where the easy courses are? You know, you don't believe that? Go look at Rate My Professor. And not just Rate My Professor, lots of colleges and universities have community spaces where they talk about, go take this course, it's an easy A, go take, and so they are using the technology effectively. They're using the technology also often to get around the hard work of writing papers. The self-reported plagiarism has increased dramatically. We don't hold students accountable for plagiarism, and so you know, again, I think it's not as simple. I mean, I think it's absolutely true that faculty need to think about kind of how we deliver instruction, and we could do better in that. But again, I think it's a much more complicated matter than that, and a lot of these kind of old-fashioned ideas like academic rigor, and you got to apply yourself, you got to put in the hours, and you have to read and you have to write if you want to see these gains. That's an old school idea, but it turns out to be true.
Thank you. It'd be great if your next study was around studio teaching, because nearly 60 or 70% of our students are actually in that area, our undergraduates. And it's fascinating because they're coming from the other, my anxiety is actually the other end of the extreme where they're putting in over 100 hours a week and stuff like that, and that's causing its own problems. Nevertheless, thank you very much for a very provocative and interesting lecture and talk today, and we'll learn a lot from it. Thank you.
Thank you.